Attention, attention. Action this day, June the 1st, 1940, is what we are talking about here on We Have Ways of Making You Talk in our Dunkirk 8 Days That Changed the World special. I've moved on from Most Important Week in History. I think 8 Days That Changed the World. Or 8 Days That Saved the World.
I like that. That sounds good.
Of course, we are recording this in advance, by the way, sweet listener. And this morning I woke to see James Holland rebuking a former French ambassador.
Oh dear,
on Twitter.
Me.
What?
Me.
What?
I mean, talk about kind of old theories and enmities kind of still going on, but from a French ambassador as well. I mean, dear me.
Well, former. I mean, someone then said maybe this is why he's an ex-diplomat, you know.
Because it wasn't very diplomatic, that's for sure.
I mean, the classic, the English buggered off and left us in it.
We carried on fighting for 3 more weeks, you know.
Well, apart from that, but then also returned. Thank you very much. And I mean, the problem is then you turn into Mark Francois or some UKIPper go fucking frogs. Anyway,
I love the French. I drive around in a French car. I mean, a really old one at that.
Yeah. It's an SS car, mate. It's an SS car. Everyone knows that.
No, it's not. It's the French Forces of the Interior. Everybody knows that.
So June the 1st.
Yes, which was a Saturday back in 1940.
Which was a Saturday. Now, just before we get going, the one thing we haven't touched on much is we talked to Steve Prince at the beginning of the week about the naval contribution. But what's happening attrition-wise to the naval contribution? Because we talk about attrition an awful lot on the podcast. We talk about the idea of attriting and the idea that you wear the enemy down any which way you can, and of course, yes. With regards to the Battle of Britain, after all, the Luftwaffe is attrited in the Battle of France in a way that leaves it unable to fight the Battle of Britain. So the Navy here, in its contribution, is it leaving itself exposed with the losses and damage it's experiencing in the Dunkirk, in Dynamo? Is it leaving itself... I mean, you're shaking your head. He's shaking his head, listener. But I mean, the Navy loses what? 39 destroyers are sent into action. 6 are sunk,
41.
19 are damaged.
41.
Okay.
6
right.
6 are sunk. 5 minesweepers are sunk. 1 corvette.
Yep.
Total loss of kind of... I'm not including lighters and whalers and all the rest of it. But to the Royal Navy, total loss is our 11.
11?
Out of the largest navy in the world.
When we're talking largest navy in the world, we're talking what? How many destroyers? So the Navy deploys, you say, 41 destroyers. How many destroyers has it got in all?
Over 200.
Yeah. You see, I mean, this is also where it gets interesting. If we, because after all, I'm talking. If the let's say in your mind's eye, the next battle you're going to have to fight if you're the Navy, if things carry on the way they're going, is a sea lion battle. They're not calling it that at the moment, but we're calling that with hindsight. Yeah. The next battle they may have to fight is a sea. This isn't affecting their ability to fight that battle at all, is it? I mean, I know the Navy's all over the world, and they're in the South Atlantic, and they're in Southeast Asian seas and all that sort of thing. But this isn't, and the Mediterranean. But there's an awful lot of tonnage of Royal Navy ships that if they go to warp factor 10, can be back in English waters, which is where they'd need to be. I'm not British waters necessarily. You know what I mean? Within a couple of days, within 48 hours. Yeah. So if the shit hits the fan, as it were, we keep using that expression because it sums this week up, really.
Well, this is why Charles Forbes, who is the admiral in charge of the Home Fleet, is very against massing in southeast England at this time, because he says you don't need to. There is nowhere around the British Isles that we can't be within 24 hours. And there is no way the Germans are going to launch an invasion without us knowing about it 24 hours beforehand. Because of our
same way... Well, exactly, which is where I was then going with...
It is not like D-Day in 1944 in reverse, where we have, we have maintained that secrecy right up to the last minute about where and when it's going to happen. The Germans simply wouldn't be able to do that because they don't.
No, they wouldn't be able to do that.
They don't destroy the RAF.
But by the same token, well, exactly, which is where I was going with this. So if the way the Navy are actually able to handle this level of loss, deliver an operation like this and cope with the level of loss that it delivers, in many ways, is then reflected by the Air Force and the Battle of Britain. Is that or Fighter Command rather? Is Fighter Command? There is the dramatic moment. What are your reserves? All that. When Churchill goes down to see what's going on. Yeah, but that's only in Park's group.
Oh, yeah, but yes, but also we don't know what tone of voice he said when he said it.
Yeah.
Okay, he has deliberately chosen to commit all his squadrons and some of 12 Group as well. And what that means is, ranged against 300 Luftwaffe bombers and fighters at around 3 p.m. on the afternoon of Sunday the 15th of September, he now has 335 Spitfires and Hurricanes, i.e. their Germans are not attacking a 3-1 advantage, they're actually attacking with a numerical disadvantage, which when you add time over combat, when you kind of consider that there's another 370s elsewhere in Britain, it's not a problem. So he might have just said, he says, where are all the reserves? And he goes, oh, there aren't any. But how it's always told is, there are none. In a kind of sort of, it's come to this.
Oh dear.
Yes, but we don't know he said it in that voice. That's just our interpretation
and
of the words.
And also, Park may well have said, "Well, what we're doing is because we have this series of advantages at our, and he's Churchill's quoted selectively because it's dramatic. Because after all, and it's a thing that we've talked about before, and that we will be talking about in the future with some of our guests, is British power at this point. The Dunkirk evacuation, all right, the BEF of and it's their right and left flanks that have both folded. That is why the BF are having to be extracted out of this lozenge. And the BF had a rough time. But this is an expression of raw British power, dynamo. Yeah. What the British have at their disposal. And how many destroyers was it? It was what? How many destroyers was it again in total?
41 are involved. And
no, in the Navy.
Over 200.
Over 200. So what? Deploying a fifth maybe of. He's going to go. James has gone to go look it up in the Naval's official history. He's got. There's a fat book has appeared. They're basically. Let me. For those of you who haven't seen the live cast actually, James isn't in the room he normally does the live cast in.
So
James behind him has.
Let me go through this, Al. Okay, so 1st of September 1939, 15 battleships, 7 aircraft carriers, 15 heavy cruisers, 41 light cruisers, 8 anti-aircraft cruisers, 1 mine-layer cruisers, 113 modern destroyers, 68 older destroyers, 53 modern submarines, 12 older submarines, 54 corvettes, etc., 44 fleet minesweepers, 2 gun monitors.
So I mean, if nothing else, in that you didn't even get onto destroyers until you'd worked your way through all the kinds of cruisers and aircraft carriers. So the Navy isn't even deploying its top end kit, is it?
You're nearly at 100 capital ships before you get to the modern destroyers. Right.
Okay. So what? One of the things Dynamo
Germany, by contrast, has 22 destroyers.
Well, there we are.
And they lose half of which 7 of them in Norway.
Well, I was going to just say half of which are at the bottom of the sea in Norway. I mean, the thing is, but this is the point I'm trying to make, is that so much of 1940, it's obvious why it's depicted as Britain on it, poor old plucky us on our arse. But we're deploying a fifth of our destroyer strength to do this? One of our capital ships, 1 cruiser. And
so there's only 6 corvettes involved.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're talking about here is in fact this is an expression of British strength, British Dominion imperial strength,
totally,
and in fact Allied strength. There's plenty of Dutch ships there and all this sort of stuff, rather than necessarily an expression of weakness. And it's so interesting that the German conclusion is Britain's on its arse and ripe for the picking at this moment, and you can see why they're thinking that. But it's a very poor reading of the situation.
It's a very poor reading, and it's not as if the British hide their naval strength either. There is a reason why the Royal Navy is called the senior service, and you don't need to be brilliant in English to understand the translation of that. I mean, that's what it means. And I mean, when you're looking at total ships sunk and destroyed, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, the figures vary because they're not 100% sure of the number of little ships involved. But let's just say for the as close as it's going to be is 231 destroyed, which includes, out of that 231, 6 destroyers, 5 minesweepers, 1 corvette, 202 little ships. 70% of those losses, 70% are due to collision and misadventure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not going to be destroyers clanging into each other. This is the smaller ships. It's people rushing from the beaches, getting onto them, sinking them because they've overwhelmed them. Whatever. What is also really interesting is the proportion of ships sunk. So, only 30 British ships in total sunk by air, out of however many are involved, hundreds.
Yeah.
The total flotilla is hundreds of ships, and for 30, by all that entire effort by the Luftwaffe, is a really piss poor return.
No, that's a terrible return. But it's also because what you're doing is taking an air force that's designed for battlefield tactical intervention,
of course,
isn't it? For providing air cover and for breaking open strong points and dealing with troop masses and all that sort of thing. And it's being used to try and attack shipping, which it's never done before, because the Germans just are not they think in a land warfare way. For all the revolutionary, for all the idea that blitzkrieg is some new way of thinking revolution, it's actually
it's really one-dimensional.
It's land warfare. It's one-dimensional, and it's not. They're not thinking. They're not thinking strategically at all. I think it's also really interesting that the Luftwaffe, like you say, it's piss poor that then Goering, who as we've been talking about, has been busy getting his hand on.
He's rubbing
artwork.
His fat little grubby fingers together and thinking, "Great, let's talk about art."
Well, but that he can even turn around to Hitler and go, right, yeah, of course we could subdue the RAF now after this, because actually, it's really interesting how severely the Germans now misread the situation.
Yeah,
that they think that they can take on the RAF, and we're not talking about the RAF over France that aren't vectored, that aren't part of a defence system, and so on. Because one of the things I think people, one of the things about the German war effort is how bad the intelligence is. Right from the get-go.
Well, it's Study Blue, which is carried out by Beppo Schmidt. Now, the interesting thing is Beppo Schmidt actually becomes quite good later on. He ends up being commander of the 1st Fighter Division in 1944, having commanded a bunch of the Hermann Goering regiment, as it is, when it's sent on the ground in Tunisia. But at the time, this is why it's so bonkers, because there are numerous different intelligence units doing different functions. In the Luftwaffe, just like there are with British intelligence. You have the Y service, you've got RAF Medmenham and all the rest of it, you've got Bletchley Park, etc., etc. And it's pretty much the same with the Germans. Goering also has his own private intelligence service, which is funded by him, the Forschungsamt. But Beppo Schmidt is a colonel. He's an Oberst, so he is junior to General Martini, who is the head of Luftwaffe intelligence. But Beppo Schmidt is a survivor of the Beer Hall Putsch and is a mate of Goering's, and likes the ladies, and is fond of a glass or two. And he's a good clubbable chap. And he's also on Goering's personal staff, so his influence is far greater than Martini's. And basically, he hasn't got a clue. He doesn't speak English. He hasn't got the faintest idea what's going on. And he puts together this intelligence appreciation of the RAF, which is basically what Goering wants to hear, rather than anything approximately close to the reality. And it's just a pack of absolute nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and of course, Goering's eye isn't on the ball either.
It's not on the ball
at all. So someone who's talking nonsense and is in a position of sort of clubbable, connected Nazi influence can wreak even more damage.
Yeah. So just when they're having the final big conference about the Luftwaffe conference on, I think it's 1st of August, 2nd of August, something like that. Right. So Hitler gives a kind of go ahead for the all-out assault at the end of July, and then Goering calls all his commanders together, and he takes them to Karenhall, which is this massive place he's got in the woods northeast of Berlin. And they all turn up, and he goes, "Come and have a look at this." And he takes them to his room, and there's this absolutely enormous train set And he starts picking the trains and stuff. And he goes, "You're going to love this, guys." Presses a little switch, and a whole load of bombers come over on wires over the top of it. Well, that's a guy who's kind of totally on it. But, I mean, I've been kind of working for the last 15 years trying to realign our understanding of Britain. We've just fallen into this narrative of Little Britain against the mighty Nazi war machine. And it just needs a realignment. The army was very small. We've all accepted that. We know that. Where they were put into action, they fought very well, but there was a very good practical reason in 1938, 1939 for having a small army, and into 1940. Post the fall of France, a strategic earthquake, they then kind of realign it and sort of go, okay, right, we need to rapidly kind of raise 55 divisions and, from the tin pot army. But the army is the smallest thing. It's all about air power and it's all about naval power, and that suits Britain's strategic purpose before the war, and it suits its strategic purpose at the start of the war, when France, a major player, a superpower by kind of modern day standards at the time, is its ally. This idea that we're all a bit shit is just nonsense. And, the reason we win the Battle of Britain is because we're considerably better. We're fighting the battle that we've prepared for, with the world's first fully coordinated air defence system, with better tactics, with better intelligence, with better aircraft production, with better repair production, etc., etc., etc. And the Germans are all at sea. We've been blinded by the Blitzkrieg and blinded by this tactical chutzpah, which I know is a line I've kind of said more than once, but it's just, it needs realignment. But the Dunkirk evacuation is possible because of the might of the Royal Navy.
Yeah, exactly. But that also then leads to Churchill was first Sea Lord, right? Wasn't he? Before he becomes Prime Minister. And, Winston is back in September 39 when he returns to being first Sea Lord, which he had been at the beginning of the First World War. That was the job he had in the war before. Before the Dardanelles, and then before going to the Somme, and then before being Minister of Munitions, right? So he knows if there's one person in the cabinet who knows exactly what the Navy is capable of and exactly, actually, how safe the island redoubt, if you want to, if we're going to lapse into Churchillian language, the island redoubt is safe. If there's one person who should know that, it's Churchill.
Yeah.
If there's one person who'd be absolutely certain of that. And I think that often, if you feed that into all this political stuff we've talked about in the last week, and him holding his nerve in front of everyone else, if there's one person whose word you're going to take on how strong the Royal Navy is, it's him, isn't it?
Yeah, completely.
So maybe maybe that's
and
maybe that's the conversation in the Rose Garden with Halifax. Maybe it's Churchill
it had
saying,
nothing to do with the Labrador.
Yeah, exactly. It's not photos. It's not pictures with the Labrador. But you know what I mean. And I think even the cabinet crisis, you if you view it. Because I think people often look at the cabinet crisis and go, how on earth did he pull that off, given our weak position? And the fact is, as we've just been saying, and as, like you say, the last 15 years you've been trying to disabuse people of this notion, it's not such a weak position. And maybe what he's having to do is go, oh, for God's sake, you lot, pull your skirts up. Come on.
Yeah.
He's
definitely doing that. I don't think there's any doubt that is what he's saying.
But also that it's not such. But it's also not such a difficult case to make.
Yeah.
I think
the other case he makes is, if we start opening peace feelers, we are directly going against the terms of our alliance with France.
Yeah.
They're still fighting on. We cannot do that. Diplomatically, I suspect that's what it is that really. My gut instinct is that that's the line that persuades Halifax, because Halifax is an honourable man. And to renege on your diplomatic alliance with your ally, that's a
Well, and he's spent
perfidious.
He's spent since Eden was sacked. He spent actually best part of 2 years trying to get the diplomatic thing to work.
Right.
And has also been right on the receiving end of Hitler breaking his word, of dealing with someone who backslides and can't be trusted. And that's been the hallmark of the last 2 years of diplomacy, with the Munich Agreement falling apart, with the actual invasion of Czechoslovakia March 39 and all that. And so he knows, I think that's an excellent point. But if you've got Churchill going, look how big how big the Navy is. Come on, for God's sake.
Don't judge us through the same prism that Germany is judging itself. Because Germany is a continental power. We are not. We're an island nation with a global trading network. And it is just a different set of things. I mean, just go back to the whole Navy point, of course, is the naysayers will say, okay, well, if the Navy's so strong and got it so under control, why do you need to get all these little ships desperate, dashing across the channel? Well, the reason you need to do that is because what the Navy can't do is get destroyers onto the shore. They don't have landing craft at this time. There aren't such things as landing ships. So you need to...
just don't exist.
They don't exist. Yeah. So why, while you are getting as many people as you possibly can off the mole, and it is, 2/3 to 1/3 or whatever it is, as it fine, or 3/4 to, I think it's 3/5 to 2/5. There are still a heck of a lot of people who need to come off the beaches, and that is where the little ships come in. It is not wholesale rescuing them. But we should talk about the events of Saturday, the 1st of June, because we've just done a We Have Ways classic.
We were supposed to talk for 10, 15 minutes about the events of May the 31st.
And here we are, 22 minutes in.
I asked a question.
Well, listen, we're not forcing anybody to listen to this, Al. If they're bored and someone on Twitter said this morning said, listen to We Have We's, really boring. Full stop. Like,
really?
Okay. Yeah, fine. Whatever. It's not for him. It's not everyone's bag.
Brilliant.
I get it, and people can fast forward. If they don't want to hear about the events of 1st of June, it's fine.
Go on. So what happened on the 1st of June?
Well, of course. So the perimeter is much reduced at this stage, and the full weight of 4 German infantry divisions who are attacking 6 understrength battalions at this point by the 1st of June.
Yeah.
So most of those guys have moved into position on 30th, 31st, and there's some amazing stories of this. So you've got the from Bergue, you've got the 1st Loyals, you've got the 2nd, 5th Leicesters in reserve. They are the one reserve, but there's only about 70 of them. So they're kind of sort of reserve and a bit. Then you've got the 2nd Warwicks. Then there's a bridge which is just beyond the village of Heumel. And the other side of that, you've got the 1st East Lancs. Then you've got that's 139 Brigade. Then you've got another brigade which is 5th Borders, who are the TA battalion. Then you've got the 2nd Coldstream Guards, who've been taken out of the Guards Brigade and moved into 5th Division. And then you've got the 5th King's Own. And the 2nd Coldstream Guards are amazing because they really are full of toffs. And the Brigadier is Brigadier Beckwith Smith. And Lieutenant,
okay, chaps.
Yeah, absolutely. He's got the kind of turny-uppy moustache and all the rest of it. He eventually dies of diphtheria in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Taiwan in 1942. But right now he's full of vim, and he turns up and sees Jimmy Langley, who is a lieutenant in Number 3 Company, because guards battalions have numbered companies rather than lettered companies. He goes, "Marvellous news, Jimmy," he shouted. "The best ever!" Short of the German army deciding to call it a day which seemed improbable, I could think of no news deserving the qualifications of marvellous and the best ever. "It's splendid, absolutely splendid. We have been given the supreme honour of being the rear guard at Dunkirk. Tell your platoon, Jimmy. Come on, tell them the good news." I mean, really, is there? Talk about blimp. I mean, just absolutely.
Well, you know what? But you know what? This is actually something. I'm going to digress again now. But
that's all right. Digress away, old man.
Isn't that the way posh? There's a way that posh people process emotion and high stress that to people from the outside of posh land is completely incomprehensible. And I think very often that for instance, and it hits its sort of its high watermark is, say, for instance, in a film like A Bridge Too Far, where they stop and they go, "No, chap, we're stopping for tea," and the Americans go, "God damn it, you lamies!" That's just posh people trying to be insouciant because they're absolutely shitting themselves.
Yes.
They're terrified. And so the thing you never do is admit
fear.
You're terrified. So you don't admit, and just like Americans go, gee whiz, that was close.
Yeah.
Right? When someone is killed right next to
I tell you
them.
what, there's no way for us in a foxhole.
Exactly, and it's just the way it's. I mean, I think there's so much cultural misunderstanding, even within our country, about how posh people express
You're right. I'm
themselves
convinced
differently.
by this argument. I'm very convinced by this argument, I was reminding myself of all this morning and reading it in bed and just laughing my head off. I mean, I just thought,
because I mean, if nothing else is sarcasm, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean.
Yeah, it's
marvelous news, old boy.
Yeah.
I mean, you think,
it always reminds me of General Carlton Dwyer and amputating his own hand in 1917.
Yeah,
and when asked about it, he said it was itched a bit.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Fantastic. I mean, that's where Monty Python.
What's he going to say? It hurt like buggery, and I had to,
I nearly passed out.
I mean, yeah, exactly. Anyway, so that's the event.
So what happens with the Coastal Guards? So they've then got a sort of, for a bit they've got a 2,200 yard front, which is a lot to cover with not very much. And what's happening is early in the morning, at dawn, there's a massive artillery barrage by the Germans. The whole area is flooded by this stage, and it's kind of it's getting worse by the kind of hour. So the German infantry are kind of struggling to get up. So of course they're doing the classic thing. You lay down lots of artillery, smother the enemy, advance under the kind of under the behind that barrage. And that's what's going on. And the borders, the fifth borders, are wanting to pull back, and they do pull back. They just think the whole situation's so hopeless they need to pull back. So someone then orders them back again. And actually, it is Major McCorkadale, who is the brother-in-law of Barbara Cartland. So Barbara Cartland's already lost two brothers, but her brother-in-law is also there. And he is the guy who says, right, anyone else who moves back, shoot them. And they see two officers and they take pot shots. And they don't actually kill them, but they do take two shots. And they go right back in the line. And then there is this massive, overwhelming kind of attack by I think it's the 10th Motor Division, which would then later become would then be called a Panzer Grenadier Division later on in the war. And they're attacking, and they do actually get across the canal at this point, and there's furious fighting. So there's furious fighting it is the fifth borders falling back, this TA battalion, which enables the Germans to get across between the 2nd Coldstream Guards and the 1st East Lancashires. But the 1st East Lancashires have still managed to keep that bridge they've blown up the bridge, and the Germans can't get across there. And they're firing away, and one of the B Company commander is Marcus Irvin Andrews, who's actually a pre-war regular and has served in the Northwest Frontier and all sorts of stuff. So he's pretty experienced, and he's an amazingly good shot. He's actually quite a porky lad, I've got to say. He's a big unit. But he's a really, really good shot, and they're running low of ammunition. So they take over this barn, and he gets into the roof of this barn. And he says, right, boys, the key here is to keep killing people. Because if you fire and use your ammunition wildly, the enemy will get confident, and they'll realise that you're missing. So basically, he starts sniping, and the moment he sees an officer, he just takes them out, and he shoots 17 dead, at least, just with his rifle, and then takes over with the Bren gun. And they managed to, and both the Coldstreams and the East Lancashires, despite this breach in the 5th Borders line,
hold them up.
The Borders then come back, and they do manage to hold them up till nightfall. And Irvin Andrew gets a VC for that.
Oh, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And they do get reason. There's also an officer in the 1st East Lancashires who manages to come up with a couple of, or 2 or 3 carriers, which are these tracked vehicles which can just about get through with more ammo, which sort of keeps them in. The problem is the shortage of ammunition.
Yeah.
It's like all these things when you're kind of, you're doing a last stand. It's exactly the same as Arnhem. It doesn't matter how brave you are and how good a shot you are and all the rest of it. If you haven't got the bullets, there's nothing you can do. And they are able to then pull back that night. And that is the perimeter collapse. But of course, for the Germans to actually move up they might be able to move up with, but it's still several miles. The other thing about the East Lancashires is actually they move, they cross the line on the 30th, and they're within 3 miles of, they're 3 miles beyond the canal line, having been told to go and evacuate. And then they're told to turn around and go back and defend the perimeter.
Forward. Yeah.
So it's like really close to getting away, and then they can't. And there's not very many of them. There's like sort of
That's the seagull swooping in and taking that lottery ticket out of your hand, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And these are just a couple of battalions that out of the 6 that I've mentioned, but it's amazing stuff. And on that Saturday, daylight evacuation stops because suddenly the clouds lifted. That 10th, which has shielded them the whole week, suddenly the sun has burst through and it's beautiful weather. And the oil refineries are burning, but not as badly as they were. So it's just too dangerous to operate by night. And also because they haven't got that many people left, actually, they can sort of do it early morning, overnight from midnight up until early hours, leave it for the bulk of the daylight hours, and then resume again that evening. So on this day, the 1st of June, 64,429 lifted, of which 17,314 from the beaches, 42,181 from the East Mole. Again, 42,000. And just to reiterate, that is more than the total of German troops that were evacuated from Sicily in 5 nights. In one day.
Yeah. And 42,000 is what? How many divisions is that? That's a couple of divisions, isn't it?
No, that's best part of
3. It's 3 divisions.
15 divisions. It's 16,000 in an infantry division, so it's just under 3.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, we're going to take a brief break now, and then after the break, we'll be back with the view from the other side of the Atlantic. We are joined now we've been across the other side of the hill, the other side of the channel. We're now the other side of the Atlantic. We are joined by the Chair of War Studies at the US Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Michael Neiberg. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Yeah, and actually this is your second foray, because you and I chatted in New Orleans, didn't we, a few months back. Actually, last year, blimey, already, back in November last year. And we had a great chat then. But yeah, I mean, Mike, we just thought it'd be really interesting to see what the Americans are thinking during this strategic earthquake that is, well, less Dunkirk, but more kind of, well, it is Dunkirk, and certainly the fall of France, which is clearly going to happen by this point. By the time of Dunkirk, it's all over for the French, bar the shouting. I mean, what's going on in the States at this time? I mean, where are we with isolationism and all the rest of it?
So the way I like to think of it, there's a concept political scientists use called free riders, which is used to describe states that depend upon another state for their security. And I really do think the United States was free riding on British and French security. The expectation was, as long as the French army was there to hold off the Germans, and as long as the French and Royal Navies were there to hold off and secure the Atlantic Ocean, there would be time for the United States to figure out what it wanted to do. And Dunkirk and the collapse of France just destroys that in the blink of an eye and leads to this incredible moment of panic that waves through the United States on virtually every level, from how do we understand the way France has collapsed to what do we do about it, all the way through. But it is this genuine sense of panic that I think you really can say begins this process of the United States making its decision that it will never again subcontract its own defense to another power, a tradition that has continued, all the way to today.
That's just fascinating, isn't it? Because, I mean, Al, I don't know about you, but I never really got the sense that there was mass panic in the United States at this point. I realised that there was a kind of sort of massive wake-up call, but that's not quite the same thing.
No, it's panic.
It's actual panic because I think maybe from a British point of view that isolationism and the political currents that are running, and this is all with hindsight, obviously, all appear sort of frivolous given the what's to come, or politically unserious given what's to come and what the German threat actually by 1939 does represent. So that am I right to think that, or was isolationism still at this point deadly serious as a political force?
I think for a lot of people it remains deadly serious, and I think for a lot of people it's not so much a question of putting America's head in the sand and pretending the outside world isn't there. But it is a question of not wanting, as in the First World War, to tie ourselves down into alliances that might unduly tie America's hands. So Americans don't want to do anything that's going to put American military power behind Britain and France retaining their empires, all the same issues that had existed a generation before. 1940 just shatters all of that. And I can cite a lot of anecdotes and a lot of things about this, but one of them that I really like, there had been a Supreme Court case that had thrown out illegal wiretaps just a few months earlier. And it's right in here about May 19th or 20th, I think, that Roosevelt writes a secret memo to the Attorney General. And he says, look, that wiretap case dealt with income tax evasion. It didn't. They weren't thinking about a world in which America is out there on its own. Go ahead and ignore the Supreme Court. You do all the wiretapping you need to do. We're in a completely different situation now. And wow. There's a fear that runs through the United States, an argument that France could never have fallen if it hadn't been for fifth columnists inside, that I'm convinced influenced the way the United States thought about the Japanese internment after Pearl Harbor. It is a moment in which, just like COVID that we're dealing with right now, almost invalidates everything you had been thinking just a couple of weeks before.
So in a way, the First World War in America settles nothing, but the fortnight of Fall Gelb, of the Germans overwhelming France, changes everything in a strange way. That if we're looking at a generational, a paradigm shift in political understanding. We talked about this before, about how the Germans achieve in 3 days what they couldn't achieve in 4 years in the First World War at Sedan. And this happens again politically because of this, as we've called it earlier, the strategic earthquake of the fall of France.
Right. What it really changes is the sense in the United States that we're not safe from the fire overseas. So in World War I, America understood itself to be under threat, but not from invasion or anything like that. With the fall of France, you're really dealing with two enormous problems that American strategists now have to think about. One is, how do you respond if the Nazis, the German government, takes over the French fleet, which would give it a sea domination to rival its land domination? And two, what will be the fate of French colonies? And in the American mindset, this is Martinique in the Caribbean, which is where the French aircraft carrier is, and it's Dakar, Senegal, just over the Atlantic Ocean from Brazil. So the fear is that now what you can see is the Germans with French help, or with Germans just taking French assets, it's not so much that they're going to march down New York City, but that they could begin installing friendly governments in Latin America. They could threaten the Panama Canal. Roosevelt's explicit that from Martinique they could bombard a city like Miami or New Orleans. So it's this sense that now you're in the crosshairs in a way that you weren't in 1917, 1918. But the fundamental question comes back. What do you want to do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think a lot of people don't appreciate either that after the First World War and the kind of massive reduction in size of the US military, for best part of 2 decades, America has been a really, really minor military nation. The army has been grind down to almost nothing. There is almost nothing in the Air Corps. There literally are 74 fighter planes in September 1939 and 50 B-17s. That's literally it. From being the kind of world's leading TNT manufacturer, there is almost no one making TNT in 1939 or indeed in 1940. And so suddenly you've got this, although the Navy has been sort of kept up pretty much up to speed in the interwar years. That is it. And there is this theory, isn't there, that if you have a small military, then you don't use it. So if you don't want to get into wars, then have a small military. And that's how to kind of avoid getting into conflict. And the converse is true, that if you have a large military, you will use it. And as has been proved in American sort of foreign policy ever since. But
There are two.
It's this kind of like we've got to go. The slate is clean. I sort of mentioned Ground Zero when we were chatting before we went live, but it sort of is in a way, isn't it? It's like it's a blank sheet of paper. Let's start again, but we've got to really move. We've got to get a shift on.
There's two documents that I found that tell me it's also a conceptual change. It's a mental change. One is from Matthew Ridgway, later famed commander in World War II, who was then an officer in the War Plans Division. A couple of weeks before the invasion of the Low Countries, he writes a memo in which he says, look, the only real strategic need the United States has is better runways and better access to underground storage facilities for petroleum in Latin America. That's it. That's all we need. A couple of weeks after the fall of France, he writes something in which he says, look, there are 5 American strategic global needs. We can only do one of them right now. and that is defend the Western Hemisphere for the foreseeable 18 months. After that, if we don't get moving, we can't do anything. The other report was from Alan Dulles, future CIA director, and Dulles writes a memo in which he says, look, the only choice we really have is to take this bad situation of weak American military power and turn it into a positive by trying to show the rest of the world that the way to solve the world's problems is through non-military effects. Now, we know that's not the way the United States is going to go, right? But to me, it's fascinating. It shows just what do you do when you're faced with a calamitous national security problem and, as you said, almost no resources with which to deal with it. What do you do in a situation like that? So Ridgway's answer is forget the Pacific, forget deploying anything to Europe, forget everything except trying to defend the countries of the Western Hemisphere.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. But I mean, what Roosevelt does do is he acts incredibly fast, doesn't he? He suddenly realizes, okay, I am going to fire some of my kind of my secretaries of state. I'm going to get rid of some of those. I'm going to bring in some other guys, even if they're Republicans. And I'm also going to harness big business. And those are two dirty words sort of
That's
emerged.
right. I'm going to bring them in because they're Republicans. So, there's also a major shift in the Republican Party because of the fall of France. Robert Taft, a very conservative, almost the poster boy of isolationism, was leading in the Republican presidential campaign. Remember, 1940 is a presidential election year for the U.S.
Yeah.
Instead, out of nowhere comes Wendell Willkie, who is an interventionist Republican. So, as a result of that, there's no partisan discord over this, right? Everybody, Republican and Democrat alike, understand what's going on here. So, as you noted, Roosevelt moves very quickly to get rid of his Secretary of War and Secretary of Navy, replaces them both with Republicans, which is an explicit political statement on his part. He sends another Republican, Bill Donovan, future head of the CIA, OSS CIA director, sends him to Europe to assure friendly governments.
Yep.
It's a bipartisan thing, and as you noted, it comes with, I think the figure was the entire U.S. budget, the entire federal government's budget was $8 billion. Only 20% of that spent on defense. In the spring of 1940, the U.S. commits $12 billion to spend on defense. So it's committing, 150% of the entire federal budget, and it's bipartisan. So it is definitely, as you noted, an earthquake type of moment for the United States, and one that I would argue we haven't shifted our mentality since that moment, except for a very, very brief period at the end of the Second World War.
And there's all sorts of weird acts which have been brought in by Congress in the intervening years between the end of the First World War and 1940 to kind of make it hard for future companies and big businesses to profit from any kind of war manufacturing. Is it the Vincent Trammell Act? I think it is. There's this kind of sort of complicated amortization rules and all the rest of it. And slowly, but not even slowly, but very quickly, Roosevelt dismantles all those, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And it's bipartisan. Everybody wakes up. Even the Robert Tafts, which again is the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, even they kind of start calming down and saying, okay, we got to rethink the way that we're going to do this. We may not want to rescue Britain and France again, but we now realize that the gun is now cocked at us, and we've got to start rethinking the way that we want to do this. So there's virtually no opposition. I mean, I think at one point they vote Roosevelt essentially a $100 million slush fund with no congressional oversight at all. And nobody blinks at it. Nobody blinks.
That's amazing, isn't it?
So it's unfathomable to think of them doing something like that had it not been for the fall of France.
Is this a reflection of public opinion as much as sort of the political, the American polity realizing that this is what it needs to do? Is that, I mean, what's happening in the papers and what's happening in public opinion?
Yeah, so...
or is this being led by the political classes who actually realised what they need to do?
The new Secretary of the Navy is a guy named Frank Knox, who's a Republican who had actually run for vice president on the Republican ticket. And Roosevelt, to his credit, brings in a former rival, former guy that ran against him, and brings him in. And one of the reasons is that he's a Chicago-based newspaper magnate. So, the Midwest had been a kind of center of American isolationism. Lindbergh's from Minnesota. And Knox is one of these people who comes in and says, look, Mr. President, they're waking up in the Midwest. Like, they're coming to realize that if France can be beaten to its knees, we're in trouble over here, too. You need to lead this. You need to be in front of this. So I think by the fall of France, I think you're starting to see the American public wake up too. Time magazine, I think it was, or Life, one of those two, shows this map, that shows Dakar very, very close to Brazil, and shows, all of these countries in South America, which is basically all of them, that have kind of pro-German, pro-Nazi movements. So again, it's this sense that we're not going back to rescue Britain and France again. We're doing this because we're now the ones in the crosshairs.
Yeah,
that's fascinating, isn't it? Do you think is there a kind of sort of feeling that, obviously in Britain we have the national government, which is sort of cross-party. Is there a case that, for the November 1940 presidential election, that yes, Roosevelt is a Democrat, but actually what you're voting for here is a war leader rather than just a political president?
Well, this is the strange thing. So back in that time,
even though you're not a war at that point.
The Republican and Democratic parties weren't quite as ideologically divided as they are now. There was plenty of overlap. So people like Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, was a Republican, but very close ideologically to Roosevelt. It's a different kind of political process than we have now. But that's why I think Willkie's rise to the head of the Republican Party in 1940 is so important. It means that there won't be any major disagreement between the two parties when it comes to preparation and when it comes to foreign policy. And then later, when Roosevelt is president, he sends Willkie overseas in 1941, I think, 42, maybe early 42, on this around the world kind of tour, both to convey America's message, but to come back to him and say this is what's going on in the rest of the world. So there's not a lot of ideological space between the two parties once Willkie becomes a nominee.
And do you think once Roosevelt does come out and say, yes, I'm going to run for the historic third term, do you think that fourth term rather? Do you think that's no, it is a third term, isn't it?
It is third.
Do you think it's a done deal? Right from the word go. I mean,
well, I think that the preparations are a done deal. The fact that you're going to spend all this money, you're going to introduce peacetime conscription for the first time, you're going to do a Bases for Destroyers Act, all of that stuff is a done deal. The question really becomes, at what point, to use a modern phrase, at what point do you draw a red line? If the Germans take over Dakar, if the Germans take over Martinique, are those red lines that draw you into the war or not? And those are questions nobody really has a very good answer to, which is why America's Vichy policy becomes so incredibly confused, right? So the one thing the U.S. wants is for France to keep those assets out of German hands. And as long as they do, the U.S. is more or less willing to give Vichy what it wants. The U.S. government is willing to do that.
And so has friendly diplomatic relations with Vichy.
More than that, it sends Admiral Leahy, one of the most talented American administrators of the era, over there as the ambassador, with food aid programs and loans and all of this stuff. So it's a complicated and very strange history. But what Leahy is really there to do is to try to keep those colonies and keep those ships out of German hands, because as everybody tells Roosevelt from George Marshall on down, if the Germans get a hold of the French fleet, we can't defend the coastlines of the United States, let alone project American interests worldwide.
Because we've talked about Meza Kabir in the course of this week as the part of the British sort of reaction, and then how the French reacted to that. So what did the Roosevelt government make of that? Were they like, well, fair enough, because that keeps ships out of German hands, doesn't it? So that serves the American interest as well as the British.
Yeah, so legally the Americans have to sort of object and say, well, look, I mean, the British attacked a neutral state, unprovoked attacked a neutral state. That's a violation of international law. But privately they're saying, look, we couldn't risk those ships falling into German hands. So even though this was a really awful way of dealing with the problem, it's a number of capital ships that we no longer have to worry about. The concern the United States has is after Meza Kabir, as you guys know, the Germans took away Article 8 of the armistice, which meant that the French fleet didn't have to stay bound to the ports in which it had been located. So the Americans are worried that what the French might do in order to keep the ships safe from the British is move a lot of those to Martinique. So what do you do if there's a powerful Vichy fleet that's right there in the Caribbean? How would you handle a problem like that? Or if they all go to Dakar, how would you handle a problem like that? So I think privately most Americans are relieved, but and the French ambassador really doesn't make a very good case to Roosevelt. The French ambassador kind of comes in and says, well, look, Roosevelt says, look, we'll buy all of your warships from you. You need money. We don't want the ships sitting out there. We'll buy them. And the French, of course, say no to that. And Roosevelt comes up with all of these schemes to try to help. And the French say no one after the other. So the United States is not particularly pleased by that. And there are reports, the British intel did a pretty good job of convincing American reporters that one of the reasons they did the Mers el-Kabir raid is because the Germans were about to take those ships. Now, that's not true, but it sells well to a terrified American public.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And listen, Mike, I've got to ask you about Joe Kennedy, because he's the ambassador. He's a complete doom-monger. He's kind of got a little bit of admiration for the Nazis. He hates commies. He's not kind of the most helpful U.S. ambassador in London at the time. But lots of other people come over. There's some fantastic people. Raymond Lee, who is one of the military attachés, is very pro-British and thinks that Britain can hold out. You mentioned Bill Donovan. There's others. There's Tui Spots comes over and says, I can't see how the Luftwaffe are going to win this one. Yeah. And it's all being fed back. Then there's Bill Murrow and Ernie Pyle coming over and writing about kind of British phlegm and all this kind of stuff. It's a kind of that summer of 1940 that follows the fall of France is an interesting time for Americans.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so you're kind of rediscovering Britain in a way, right? So I think it's Lord Lothian, the ambassador before Hastings, right, who says something like, the Americans were speaking of us in hushed tones the way you would speak of a dying patient, right? So what the Americans are trying to figure out is whether Britain is a bet worth backing. So Donovan goes over, as you noted. Donovan comes back and says, "Yeah, they're in it. They're going to be fine." So the question becomes, what should we do as Americans? Should we give the British enough to win this thing? Should we do enough to keep them fighting until we can get ourselves mobilized, which is the Vichy kind of allegation that the United States is only going to keep the British alive long enough so that they do the fighting? What percentage of your resources should go to Great Britain? But the attitude towards Britain, of course, it changes and becomes incredibly positive, and that's a good thing. Ironically, it's Mers el-Kabir that helps to do that. So Britain's willingness to attack a neutral French fleet convinces Roosevelt and many in his inner circle that they're willing to fight on in the war. So it's a weird way that these things go on. There's also the visit of René de Chambrun, a descendant of the Marquis de Lafayette and Pierre Laval's son-in-law, who comes over, and for his pro kind of collaboration as he later becomes, one message he does bring is he says, look, I don't think the Germans can beat the British. So they are a bet worth backing. The British are too powerful on sea. The Germans are too powerful on land. So what the Americans should do, in his view, is help negotiate an armistice between the two, because neither one is going to be able to knock out the other. And of course, when we do this as historians, we have to remember this is well before the Soviet Union is involved in this. So from the perspective of 1940, that's the way it looks to a lot of Americans. This war will go on indefinitely because the two sides are so asymmetrical.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
Well, because we on our little Patreon group, we were discussing what if the BEF doesn't get away, and one of the things that our subscribers were sort of got stuck into the idea is what difference would that have made to the American reaction, rather whether Britain would have been able to fight after losing all its soldiers. I mean, it loses all its equipment in 1940 anyway, but in after Dunkirk anyway, but not its people. But if it lost its people as well, we were arguing what would effect would that have had in the US? Would Britain have been actually out for the count then, in American opinion? And even if Britain is out for the count, what then is the US government going to do about Germany? Because as you say, the threat is via the colonies, is via the what's left of the French Empire as much as anything else. I mean, then there's a completely different question to ask, isn't there?
Yeah, there is a plan, though I don't know how successful it would have been. One of my favorite documents that I found in the French archives, when Donovan makes this great trip that he makes to Europe, the Vichy and German agents are worried immediately that he's going to try to get to Algeria and Morocco. What they think he wants to do is meet with Maxime Weygand and convince Weygand to build up a French army in Africa that the Americans will then supply. So part of the answer is if the BEF isn't there, if British land power isn't there, there might be a way to build Weygand up as an American ally inside Africa. Now, Weygand himself finds out about this. He warns the French government and he warns his friends who are ambassadors at various countries in the U.S., look, don't let Donovan come into North Africa. Donovan goes over, with a fake name. I mean, it's great stuff. It's fantastic stuff. He falsifies flight records. I was able to track all this stuff down with documents. The TWA, believe it or not, archive has some of these flight records. So I was able to, it's just fantastic. It's classic kind of spy stuff. Except that Donovan, brought his own monogrammed suitcase with him, so the Germans immediately knew who he was. So apparently he had a history of these kind of very strange, uncharacteristic kind of mental lapses. But one plan is if the BEF isn't there, there might be a way to build up a free French force in North Africa under Weygand that hopefully Pétain would eventually back as well. So it just shows, how wide open the range of options were in 1940, how confused things were in 1940, and really how strange an environment it is that you're dealing with. So Donovan never did meet with Weygand, but Churchill never gave up on this idea either. Churchill always thought that sooner or later Weygand, the man who had handed the armistice terms to the Germans in 1918, would sooner or later want to be a part of this great movement. So, the U.S. holds on to Weygand much longer than the British do. The British flip over to de Gaulle much more quickly than the United States does. But there's always this hope that you can kind of bring the French back onto your side at some point.
And indeed they do, don't they? Because in 1942, there's Operation Torch, and Mark Clark and his little coming out of his submarine and having the secret talks with Darlan's representatives, and then you've got the French Expeditionary Corps going into Italy. You've even got a tabor of gooms in Sicily. So you have got French colonial troops operating on the side of the Allies from the end of 1942 all throughout 1943, and of course joining with 7th US 7th Army in southern France in August 1944.
Fascinatingly, though, under neither of the two major American hopes, the first one being Weygand, the second one being Henri Giraud, right? It ends up being under
right.
who is the last guy the Americans want in that role. So it's a really strange tale of how Vichy plays into all this and plays into American thinking. And, to my mind, it's connected with everything the United States does really until the end of the war. It's connected to Japan because the Japanese take over Indochina. It's connected to the Africa policy as the United States is trying to figure out what Africa looks like post-war. It's a tangled web that they weave.
And all because of Dunkirk and the fall of France. Amazing. The strategic earthquake. Just to bring it back neatly. Yeah. Well, Mike, that's just been amazing, absolutely fascinating. Really fascinating. And I'm lucky enough to have a few mates around the world who, every time I have a conversation, I always end up learning lots that I didn't know before. So that has just proved the point.
A pro tip: if you're on a secret spying mission, don't take your monogrammed luggage.
Oh, it's hilarious!
Yes, indeed.
The stuff
Phil
he does
Donovan's
is
a great
absolutely
character.
Hilarious. Yeah, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced he leaked one version of his itinerary so that he could fly on another to warn everybody he was coming, friends and enemies alike. Yet managed to slip into Portugal without anybody theoretically knowing he was there, and of course they're tracking him anyway. So it's great stuff. It's a lot of fun.
Amazing.
Well, listen, Mike, please do come back on again. And
my great pleasure.
More.
Anytime, gentlemen. Anytime.
Fantastic to hear the perspective from across the pond. More Dunkirk reflections tomorrow. Bye for now.